There was a guard who believed the war was over. His name was Captain Darius, and he stood on the walls of Samarkhan, the jewel of the East, looking out at empty plains where an enemy army had camped for 3 months. The steppe tribes had come with 60,000 horsemen, savage warriors who lived in saddles and knew nothing of civilization. They had surrounded the city, launched a few half-hearted attacks, lost hundreds of men to the city's defenses, and then, slowly, over the course of weeks, they had given up. Their camps grew smaller. Units rode away, until finally, this morning, the last of them had packed up and disappeared over the horizon. The siege was over. Samarkhan had won. The city's 40,000 elite guards, the emperor's finest soldiers, trained since childhood in warfare and discipline, they had outlasted the barbarians. Captain Darius allowed himself to smile. His men deserved rest. They had been on high alert for months. Tonight, he would authorize double wine rations. Let them celebrate. Let them relax. They had earned it. He did not know that he had just made the worst decision of his life, that the enemy had not retreated, that this had all been theater, a performance designed to lull the city into complacency, and that in 12 hours, when darkness fell, 60,000 horsemen would return, silent, coordinated, deadly, and they would take the impregnable city in under 2 hours. This is the story of how the steppe tribes captured a city protected by 40,000 elite guards. Not through strength, but through patience, through deception, through understanding that sometimes the best way to break a wall is to convince the people behind it that there is no danger, and then strike when they are sleeping. Do you know what an impregnable city looks like? Samarkhan was a fortress city built over centuries. Walls 60 feet high, 20 feet thick at the base. Guard towers every 100 yards, each one-man day and night. For massive gates, reinforced with iron and guarded by thousands. Inside, 40,000 soldiers. The emperor's elite guard. Men who had been selected from birth. Trained in combat, discipline, loyalty. They were not militia or conscripts. They were professional warriors. The best the empire had. And behind them were 500,000 civilians. Merchants and artisans and families who lived in what was considered the safest city in the world. A city that had never fallen. Not to siege, not to assault, not to treachery. Samarkhan was the jewel of the empire, and everyone knew it could not be taken. The steppe tribes knew it too, but they also knew something the city's defenders had forgotten. That confidence is a weakness, that routine is a vulnerability, and that the strongest walls cannot protect you if you open the gates yourself. The tribes had been planning this for years. Not the siege, the deception. They were nomads. Horse warriors who lived on the plains. The empire dismissed them as barbarians. Uncivilized savages who could raid and pillage but could never take a fortified city. And the tribes let them believe it. Let the empire think they were simple, predictable, incapable of complex strategy. But the tribes were not simple. They were patient. They studied their enemies, learned their routines, identified their weaknesses, and they found Samarkhan's weakness. It was not the walls. It was the guards. Specifically, their commander. Captain Darius was a good officer, disciplined, loyal, but he was also comfortable. He had served in Samarkhan for 10 years, had never fought a real battle, had spent his entire career doing drills and inspections and ceremonies. He knew tactics from books, but he had never faced an enemy who lied, who pretended to be weak, who could wait months for a single moment of opportunity. The tribes knew this, and they used it against him. The siege began 3 months earlier. 60,000 horsemen appeared on the plains surrounding Samarkhan. They set up camps, built siege equipment, crude ladders and rams that looked dangerous but were poorly made. They launched attacks every few days, charging at the gates, firing arrows at the walls, losing men, retreating. Every attack was repelled easily. The elite guards barely had to try. The tribesmen seemed disorganized, undisciplined. They would charge without coordination, fall back when they took casualties. Their siege equipment broke or was destroyed. To Captain Darius and his officers, it looked exactly like what they expected. Barbarians who did not know how to fight civilized warfare, who would eventually grow frustrated and leave. So the city waited, and the tribes, following a plan that had been years in the making, began their performance. Week by week, their camps grew smaller. Units would pack up and ride away. Publicly, during the day when the guards on the walls could see, the tribes made sure everyone knew they were leaving. They left behind broken equipment, abandoned camps, clear evidence that they were giving up. And the guards watched and smiled and believed exactly what they were meant to believe. The savages had realized they could not take the city. They were going home. But the tribes were not leaving. They were hiding. The units that rode away during the day would circle back at night, staying far from the city, hidden in valleys and forests. They did not build campfires, did not make noise. They just waited. And as the visible camps around Samarkand shrank, the hidden camps grew. Until finally, when the last visible camp was packed up and the tribes appeared to have completely withdrawn, 60,000 horsemen were actually positioned in a ring 20 miles from the city. Invisible, silent, waiting for the signal. Inside Samarkand, Captain Darius authorized the stand down. Reduce the watch. Let the men rest. Open the taverns and brothels that had been closed during the siege. Celebrate. The city had won. The gates remained closed, of course, but only a skeleton crew manned them. Most guards went to their barracks to sleep. Others went into the city to drink and relax. For the first time in 3 months, Samarkand let down its guard, and the tribes began to move. They moved at sunset. 60,000 horsemen riding in complete silence. They had wrapped cloth around their horses' hooves to muffle the sound, had removed anything metal that might jingle or clink. They rode slowly, carefully, closing the distance to the city under cover of darkness. By midnight, they were in position, surrounding Samarkand, close enough to strike, still undetected. The plan had 3 parts: infiltration, diversion, assault. The infiltration had already happened. Months ago, the tribes had sent people into the city, not warriors, merchants, traders, refugees seeking safety from the siege, people who looked harmless, who blended in, who spent months building trust, making friends, and identifying targets. One of those infiltrators was a woman named Kira. She had entered the city 6 months before the siege began, posed as a silk merchant, rented a shop near the eastern gate, became friendly with the guards, learned their routines, their shift changes, their vulnerabilities, and she had recruited help. A gate guard named Petros who was drowning in gambling debts, who needed money and was willing to betray his city for it. Kira had been paying him for months, small amounts, building his dependence, and tonight, he will earn his final payment. He would open the gate. The diversion came first. At exactly midnight, fires erupted across the city. Not random, targeted. The granaries on the western side, the armories on the southern side. Large, important buildings that would draw attention and resources. The city's fire brigades rushed to fight the blazes. Guards were pulled from the walls to help. Citizens panicked, ran through the streets. Chaos spread, and in that chaos, no one noticed a handful of infiltrators moving toward the gates. Captain Darius was woken by the alarms. Fires, multiple locations, coordinated arson. But how? The tribes had left. Unless, he ran to the walls, looked out at the dark plains. I saw nothing, but something felt wrong. He ordered the gates checked, ordered a full alert, but he was too late. By the time his orders reached the gate guards, Petros had already done his job. The eastern gate opened. Not fully, just enough. 20 feet. A crack in the city's defenses. And through that crack poured the steppe horsemen. Hundreds, then thousands. They rode through the streets with torches and weapons, heading for the other gates. The plan was perfect. Open one gate quietly. Flood in enough troops to seize the other 3 gates from the inside. Once all 4 gates were open, the main force would enter. 60,000 horsemen would flood the city. And Samarkand, for all its walls and guards, would fall in minutes. Captain Darius realized what was happening when he heard the hoofbeats. Horsemen inside the city. Impossible. But there they were. He rallied his guards, ordered them to retake the gates. But the elite guards, relaxed and unprepared, struggled to organize. Many were drunk. Others were scattered across the city fighting fires. And the tribesmen, who had been preparing for this moment for months, moved with precision. They seized the northern gate, then the south, then the western, and then, with all 4 gates open wide, the horn sounded. A single long note that echoed across the plains. The signal. 60,000 horsemen charged. The thunder of hooves was like an earthquake. They poured through the gates, flooded the streets. The elite guards tried to form defensive lines, tried to use their superior training, but they were outnumbered, overwhelmed, and most critically, they were surprised. They had gone to sleep thinking the siege was over, had woken to a city on fire and an enemy inside their walls. There was no time to organize, no time to implement the defensive strategies they had drilled, just chaos and killing and the realization that they had been played. Captain Darius fought at the northern gate, tried to rally his men, hold the line for 20 minutes. But it was hopeless. The tribesmen kept coming, wave after wave, and behind them came their leaders, the chiefs and khans who had planned this, who had spent months pretending to be incompetent, who had studied the city's defenses and found the one weakness that mattered: overconfidence. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted less than 2 hours. By dawn, Samarkhan had fallen. The elite guards were dead or captured. The fires were still burning, and the steppe tribes controlled the jewel of the east. The city that had never fallen had fallen, not because the walls were weak, but because the people behind them had believed they were safe. Captain Darius was captured at the northern gate. Wounded, defeated, they brought him before the tribal khan, an old warrior with scars and gray hair. Darius expected execution. Instead, the khan asked him a question. "Did you really think we were leaving?" Darius had no answer. The khan smiled. "You did, because that is what we wanted you to think. You saw barbarians. We saw your arrogance. You believed walls made you safe. We knew walls mean nothing if we can make you open the gates. You prepared to fight horsemen on plains. We fought you in your minds. And we won before the first blade was drawn." Then he had Darius released, sent him back to the empire as a messenger, to tell them what had happened, to spread fear. News of Samarkand's fall shattered the empire. The impregnable city had fallen in a single night. 40,000 elite guards had been defeated by tribesmen they had dismissed as savages. How? The answer was humiliating. Deception, patience, and a traitor who had opened a gate for gold. The empire's military commanders studied the defeat. I tried to learn from it. They increased gate security, changed guard rotations, implemented new protocols. But the damage was done, not to their defenses, to their confidence. The empire had believed it was invincible, that its walls and training made it unbeatable. The steppe tribes had proven otherwise, and other enemies noticed. Within a decade, the empire faced rebellions and invasions from every direction. Enemies who had learned the lesson, that the empire could be beaten, that its strength was an illusion, and that illusion had been shattered at Samarkand. The tribes did not hold the city long. They were nomads. They did not want to rule cities. They looted what they could carry, freed prisoners who would join them, and then they left, burned the gates, and rode back to the steppes. Samarkand was eventually reclaimed by the empire, rebuilt, its walls strengthened, but it was never the same. The psychological damage could not be repaired. The city that had never fallen had fallen, and everyone knew it. Kira, the infiltrator who had organized the betrayal, disappeared. Some say she returned to the tribes and was honored as a hero. Others say she was killed by the tribes to keep her from revealing their methods. The truth was never known. Petros, the guard who had opened the gate, was executed when the empire retook the city. His name became synonymous with betrayal, a warning to future guards about the cost of treachery. But his betrayal had been made possible by the tribe's long game. They had identified him as vulnerable, had cultivated him, had made the betrayal seem reasonable, easy, profitable. They had turned his weakness into a weapon. Military historians study the fall of Samarkand as a masterclass in psychological warfare. The tribes had understood that battles are not just about swords and walls. They are about perception, about what your enemy believes. The tribes had made the city believe they were weak, disorganized, giving up, and that belief had made the city weak, had caused them to lower their guard at the exact moment when vigilance was most needed. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate your enemy. Never assume victory because they seem to be retreating. And never, ever let your guard down just because the threat appears to have passed. Because sometimes the threat is waiting, watching, planning, and the retreat is just the setup for the real attack. Captain Darius lived the rest of his life in disgrace. He was stripped of his rank, exiled from the military. He wandered from city to city, taking odd jobs, drinking away his shame. And whenever anyone asked him about Samarkhan, he would tell them the same thing. I was confident. I believed the walls would protect us. I saw the enemy leaving and thought we had won. I did not understand that the real battle was not at the walls. It was in my head, and I lost it before I even knew we were fighting. He died alone, unmourned, but his story became a cautionary tale, taught in military academies, studied by commanders, a reminder that the enemy you dismiss is often the one who defeats you. The tribes continued their way of life, raiding, trading, moving across the steppes. But after Samarkhan, the empires treated them differently, not as barbarians, but as equals, as enemies who could think, plan, deceive. The tribes had earned respect through victory, and that respect changed the balance of power in the region. Decades later, a historian interviewed one of the tribal khans who had planned the assault, asked him how they had known it would work. The khan laughed. We did not know. It was a gamble. If the guard captain had been more careful, if the gates had not been opened, we would have lost thousands trying to assault the walls. But we studied him, watched him, and we understood that he was comfortable, that he wanted the siege to be over, that he would believe what he wanted to believe. So we gave him what he wanted. We gave him a retreating enemy, and he took the bait. The historian asked if the khan felt guilty about the deception. The old warrior shook his head. War is not about honor. It is about survival. We could not take that city by force, so we took it by cunning. The men who died because of our deception, they died because their commanders were arrogant, because their city believed it was invincible. We simply revealed the truth, that no one is invincible, and that believing you are is the first step toward defeat. The fall of Samarkand remains one of the most studied sieges in history, not for its violence, not for heroism or grand battles, but for its strategy, for the way it demonstrated that patience and psychology can defeat superior numbers and fortifications. The tribes had turned the city's strength, its confidence, into its weakness, had waited months for a single opportunity, and had seized that opportunity with precision and coordination that belied their reputation as disorganized barbarians. The lesson echoed through history. Do not judge enemies by their appearance. Do not assume that those who seem weak are actually weak. And do not mistake a retreat for defeat, because sometimes retreat is the most dangerous move your enemy can make. This is the story of how the steppe tribes captured a city protected by 40,000 elite guards. How they used deception and patience to achieve what force could not. How they proved that walls do not matter if you can convince the people behind them to open the gates. And how they reminded the empire that arrogance is the greatest vulnerability of all. The walls of Samarkand still stand. Taller now, stronger, but they are a monument to a lesson learned too late. That confidence without vigilance is not strength. It is blindness. And blindness, in war, is fatal.